today with Dr. Tiffany Lee, Associate Professor and Associate Director of Native American Studies here at the University of New Mexico. And Dr. Lee was gracious enough to take a few moments out of her busy schedule to discuss one of the articles we read for this week, Critical Culturally Sustaining, Revitalizing Pedagogy, and Indigenous Education Sovereignty, that she co-authored with Dr. Teresa McCarty out of UCLA. So Dr. Lee, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. So I am from New Mexico originally. I'm from Crystal, New Mexico, which is on the Navajo Nation, northwest corner of New Mexico. I'm Navajo on my mother's side, and Lakota on my father's side from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Let's see, I have 3 children and am really happy to have found a position back here in New Mexico to, where I'm around my family. And let's see, I have my degree in sociology of education from Stanford University, and I teach here in Native American Studies. Been here since 2005, or actually 2003 with a postdoc, and then so I'm really excited that I can teach in Native American Studies, which traditionally doesn't have education-focused courses and topics, so I'm glad I can contribute that.
We're very fortunate to have you here. Can you talk about the responsibility that teachers have in recognizing Native students as citizens of sovereign nations, both within and outside of schools and on and off the reservation?
Well, for teachers in New Mexico especially, I think that is a high responsibility. It's a definite responsibility of them to understand that history, given that New Mexico has 10% of the population is Native American, and we have a very vibrant and visible Native population in the state. There's lots of issues that interact with across cultures and race here in New Mexico. So it's really pertinent that teachers understand the nature of Native communities and that treaty-based relationship, because it impacts so much of policies and social and economic life in Native communities, and obviously how children learn and what they should be learning as well in schools. So
excellent. What do you perceive to be the greatest obstacle to culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy in everyday teaching practices in New Mexico?
I think one is that the lack of knowledge about the treaty-based relationships, the issue of sovereignty. What does that mean? But also to promote a culturally revitalizing and sustaining practices in schools, the teachers need access to resources. Mm-hmm. They need access to curriculum and material that is up to date, that can help to inform what they're teaching. And they need a supportive environment for that. Mm-hmm. A lot of schools, being driven by standards-based education and the type of testing that goes along with that, and a curriculum that generally is very Eurocentric. Mm-hmm. It's hard for, I think, a teacher who really believes in CSRP to do that, to do it justice if they don't have support from administrators, from other teachers, and then obviously if they don't have resources. So
right. And I know that oftentimes, and I'm going off topic a little bit, but oftentimes, folks, particularly people of color, look at education as really a tool for social reproduction. Mm-hmm. Of dominant cultural norms and values. And I think that that's a continuous struggle that we have in preparing future educators. Mm-hmm. Within an institution such as the University of New Mexico that is founded on those norms and values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where can teachers, both native and non-native, in tribal, BIE, and public schools on and off the reservation start to engage in a more culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy?
I think in terms of teachers individually, it's important to probably develop relationships with the communities that their students are coming from, or even if you don't have Native students in your classroom, find out about the communities that surround you and find out. They all have tribal education departments. Mm-hmm. Start there and just get access to resources that way, human resources that mm-hmm. way. Let's see. They can also, once they start to develop those relationships, which is key, I think that'll just open the door to a lot of other kinds of opportunities or access to information about how to be inclusive of Native people's perspectives and histories and lifeways into the curriculum. Mm-hmm.
And those resources are there. Folks just need to take the initiative to.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to be creative. It's not going to always be just in a textbook.
Right.
You're going to have to maybe invite people in to develop a relationship with students as well, who can talk about the history of their community, or people who work in nonprofit sectors or in the government sectors who work on a day-to-day with a lot of these issues, that students can really connect what they're learning to every day in real life activities. So, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. What insights do you have for teachers that would like to engage in this work but find themselves stuck between standardized reform and the need or desire to make a critical impact in providing Native students with a culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy?
Yeah, that's a tough one, I think, for a lot of teachers I work with that are trying to be inclusive, and even a school that I work with that's trying to be inclusive of Native values and curriculum and pedagogy. The way that they handled this, because they're also being a charter school, talking about the Native American Community Academy, they are also mandated to I guess to implement the same kind of testing requirements and other kinds of curriculum requirements that the state mandates for all publicly funded schools. The way that they've handled this, I think, is really to be driven by not those necessarily what the state mandates, but their own values, and try to find a way to integrate, for example, Common Core standards. Or they also have a lot of support amongst teacher groups themselves, content area and grade level, where they can talk about strategies for addressing, the state requirements with their own, how to integrate, for example, New Mexico history with Indigenous history and Indigenous governance with United States governance, for example, and really trying to find a way to integrate. But I think it takes, again, it's hard for a teacher alone to do that. It takes support from other teachers and the administrators in the school.
Absolutely, and I know in Washington State and in Montana, and this is just an aside, progress has been made in terms of incorporating Native history and culture into the curriculum, and it would be nice to see that in New Mexico too.
That reminds me now of a point I wanted to make related to this. At the New Mexico, you've heard of the New Mexico Indian Education Act?
Yes.
And a lot of teachers haven't heard of that act, and it actually is a law and policy of the state of New Mexico that requires all teachers, specifically schools that serve Native students, but it's really addressing all schools in New Mexico, to be inclusive of that. And the act has several provisions, for example, including Native language courses, and including having promoting Native teachers or recruiting Native teachers. But if it's, it's not just in terms of who's in the classroom, but it's what's being taught in the classroom as well, being culturally responsive. So that act, I think, is key also for holding the state accountable for addressing those issues, being CSRP education.
Absolutely. Thank you. What insights do you have for teachers that serve student bodies in which Native youth make up a small percentage of the students they serve?
Well, I think, like I was saying before, I think it's a responsibility of all teachers, regardless if they have Native students in their classrooms or not, to be inclusive of that history, and because it's important for all New Mexico students to understand, everybody's history in the state, not just history, but contemporary issues that affect everyday life. I would be surprised if they don't have, many. Well, that's true. In many places, it's a very small population, but that doesn't diminish their the importance or the significance of what those students can contribute, but also what everyone can learn about Native people and issues in the state.
I think it's also important to consider, the fact that if you look at whose culture and whose values are predominant in the education system, even in communities where the majority of students are Native or African American or Latino, that still those dominant cultural norms and values seem to be centered. So why can't we make more of an effort to include the voices and perspectives and histories of these other communities? And
it's actually very transformative once you do. Is this okay?
Yeah, that's right.
James Banks writes about transformative academic knowledge, and the idea when you teach truth to children and students about each other's history, in the classroom, it humanizes who those children are for each other.
Absolutely.
And then they realize the injustice that's happened to all these communities, and they want to do something about it. It transforms them. They want to now create good in the world and make everybody's life better. It's a positive outcome and result. It doesn't create radicalism in the sense of being unpatriotic. It actually has the opposite effect. I think it motivates children to want to make America a better place.
Absolutely, and I think that ties in nicely to the idea of culturally sustaining pedagogy, is putting all of these different cultural values in conversation and histories in conversation with one another. And I think most recently, for example, there was a case of two young white girls that wore the N-word on the back of their shirt, and they ended up being suspended, and the administration took care of it in-house and tried to keep it out of the media as much as they could, unsuccessfully. But also the idea of mascots. If we aren't educating young people about the cultural histories and present-day issues of all communities, then we're setting them up to ultimately reproduce the inequities that are persistent to this day, both within and outside of education. And I think that we can hold history books, they're very much complicit in that process. What additional resources, strategies, insights, perspectives, and suggestions do you have for teachers to more clearly understand and engage in culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy?
So, like I was saying before, the issue of access to resources is really important, and this is where teachers can think out of the box, perhaps, and inviting community people from the neighboring communities to their classrooms. But also there's lots of other resources nationally that teachers can look to, such as the National Indian Education Association and the American Indigenous Studies Association. They put out reports or policies, and even some offer some curriculum guides to help teachers with being more inclusive and understanding that history themselves, if they feel like that's an area that's lacking in their own education. But again, I think it's really just developing relationships with Native communities around you. I think they would welcome that because they understand that's not the education. Their perspectives aren't included in most public schools, even on reservations and in tribal communities. So I think they would really welcome that, showing that kind of reciprocity there. Yeah.
Well, and I know that one of the things that we fail to do, both in formulating education policy and preparing educators for the classroom, and in terms of our teaching, is we fail to listen to the voices of the students that are actually in our classrooms, the students that we're responsible for educating. And I think it's important to create spaces to listen to those voices so that we can learn how we can serve them better as well. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Just going off of your last point, I think that's also that's where you can be experiential in your teaching approach, is by calling upon the students to share their own backgrounds, what they know about their communities, and it's also a nice way to connect to a community through your students and their families. If you're feeling unsure about how to go about, I guess, interacting with a tribal community, go through your students and their families, because they're the segue, they're the liaison, they're from that community, and can offer a lot to understanding for you as an educator and for the other students in the classroom. And I think that would just really build their self-confidence as well, when you're really valuing where they're coming from and what they have to contribute.
Taking interest in developing those relationships.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Lee, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it, and thank you again for your work.
Yeah, thank you.